Phuoc Tuy Province and Nui Dat are names that hold significant meaning for Australian Vietnam veterans. More Australian soldiers were stationed in Phuoc Tuy than anywhere else in Vietnam, and during their time in the province, and occasionally in neighboring areas, their base was situated at Nui Dat in the heart of the province. While members of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam operated throughout South Vietnam, and the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment was stationed at Bien Hoa in 1965 to 66. From 1966 until their departure at the end of 1971, 15 Australian infantry battalions, along with various support units, operated in Phuoc Tuy. Although the Australian Logistics Support Group and the helicopters of No. 9 Squadron RAF, based in nearby Vung Tau, weren't located in the province, they sent elements to Nui Dat, and the helicopters flew missions across the province. So, why was Phuoc Tuy chosen as the center of Australian military operations? Why was the 1st Australian Task Force based at Nui Dat, and who made the decision to place it there? The latter question is straightforward. Lieutenant General Sir John Wilton, the Chief of the General Staff, was responsible for that decision. However, what influenced Wilton's choice? This chapter aims to explore these questions and also looks into why Australia sent a 2-battalion task force to Vietnam in 1966 instead of a more balanced 3-battalion one. General Wilton was appointed Chief of General Staff in January 1963 at the age of 52 and brought with him a wealth of command, operational, and staff experience. After graduating from the Royal Military College in 1930, he served in the British Artillery in India before joining the Indian Mountain Artillery in Burma. By May 1939, he returned to Australia to work with the Coast Artillery until May 1940, when he joined the Australian Imperial Force. He served as Brigade Major of the 7th Division Artillery during the Syrian campaign in 1941 and attended the Middle East Staff School. From August 1942 to August 1943, he was Chief Operations Staff Officer for the 3rd Division during the advance towards Salamaua in New Guinea. After that, he joined the Australian military mission in Washington, D.C., before going back to operations in May 1945 as a pivotal member of General Sir Thomas Blamey's headquarters on Morotai and briefly in Manila. Following the war, Wilton transitioned to Army headquarters in Melbourne. By 1947, he had become the Director of Military Operations and Plans. In July 1950, he traveled to Malaya as part of a mission that assessed the British Commonwealth's campaign against communist insurgents in the area. He attended the Imperial Defence College in London in 1952, after which he took command of the 28th Commonwealth Brigade in Korea. This brigade was part of the 1st Commonwealth Division and included 2 Australian and 2 British battalions. They occupied a crucial defensive area that protected Seoul along the battle line stretching across the Korean peninsula. By November 1955, Wilton had risen to Brigadier General Staff at AHQ, focusing on the defense of Southeast Asia and addressing issues like the Malayan Emergency, Vietnam, and the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. He was promoted to Major General in March 1957, serving as Commandant of the Royal Military College until June 1960, when he became Chief of the Military Planning Office in Sieto headquarters in Bangkok. In that role, he tackled the alliance's strategic challenges in the region, particularly the conflicts in Laos and Vietnam. He later was appointed Chief of the General Staff. Wilton was exceptionally suited for his role as the main military advisor to the government. He was reserved, disciplined, and tactful, which earned him the trust of ministers. He had a clear vision for the military and understood the significance of alliances in defending Australia. Most importantly, he was a person of strong character who believed firmly in his mission and wasn't swayed by personal ambition. However, he appeared less suited for frontline command. Despite this, he accumulated significant command experience with continuous regimental postings during the first decade of his service, performing effectively as a brigade commander in Korea. Yet he wasn't known for his engaging personality when interacting with soldiers or junior officers. Dubbed Smiling Jack and later Sir Jovial, he gained a reputation for his lack of small talk. Soldiers followed him not because of his charisma, but due to their confidence in his judgment and his genuine concern for their welfare. Few Army leaders have encountered the wide range of challenges that Wilton faced during his 3 years as Chief of the General Staff. A significant concern was the worsening strategic landscape in Southeast Asia, marked by Indonesia's confrontation with the newly formed state of Malaysia in 1963, notably sending volunteers to fight in Sabah, Sarawak, and even mainland Malaysia. Australian troops were stationed in Malaysia, and the government sent Army engineers to Sabah. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam had been dispatched to Vietnam in 1962, and by 1964, the government sanctioned team members to serve as field advisors. As the demand for more deployments grew, Wilton informed the government that the Army's size was insufficient to fulfill the commitments. In November 1964, the government unveiled a significant expansion plan for the Army, which included a selective national service scheme. This boost in personnel coincided with new weapon purchases, updated equipment, and the building of additional facilities. Wilton transitioned the Army from the pentropic structure, which featured 5 large battalions per division without a brigade system, to a tropical configuration, incorporating 9 smaller infantry battalions and intermediate task force headquarters within a division. This change, combined with the National Service Initiative, enabled the Army to enlarge from 4 battalions in 1964 to 9 by 1967. In March 1965, 3 RAR and 1 Special Air Service squadron were dispatched to Borneo, followed by the arrival of 1 RR in South Vietnam in June 1965. Wilton did not hesitate to take on these operational responsibilities. He was convinced that provided the Australian government clearly defined its objectives, a combat commitment in Vietnam was essential. However, drawing from his previous experiences, he was resolute in ensuring that 1 RAR would not face unnecessary casualties. To grasp why 1 ATF was deployed to Phuoc Tuy in May and June of 1966, it's vital to look at how 1 RR had been utilized in the year prior. When the Cabinet approved 1 RR's deployment in April 1965, Wilton advised Sir Edwin Hicks, the Secretary of the Department of Defense, that since the Australian battalion would operate alongside U.S. forces, it needed a compatible role. Under no circumstances should it be held accountable for a separate area, as it lacked both the size and organization to manage such a situation. On April 20th, the Defense Committee addressed Wilton's concerns. During the session, Sir James Plimsoll, Secretary of External Affairs, pressed Wilton, asserting that Australian troops ought not to be positioned alone in vulnerable spots. If Australia's sole battalion in Vietnam were to be entirely lost, our presence there would vanish, among other significant implications. We need to approach this with caution, making sure not to convey any hint of pampering our troops. However, it would be beneficial for the relevant commanders to have an informal discussion. The following weekend, Wilton went over the plans with Brigadier Ken Mackay, the DMO&P at AHQ. Mackay was destined to play a crucial role in the decision to base 1 ATF in Phuoc Tuy Province. At 48, Mackay was an exceptionally qualified officer. After graduating from the RMC in 1938, he served in both artillery and infantry roles during the Second World War, gaining significant experience in joint staff positions. Towards the later stages of the war, he was part of a small team that provided up-to-date briefings to Field Marshal Brooke, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, in London. He was also the Joint Secretary for the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Australia during the formation of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force in Japan, and worked at Australia House in London during the 1956 Suez Crisis. Wilton assigned Mackay to start planning for the deployment of a full battalion group, which would include an artillery battery and an engineering troop, to Vietnam. This marked the initial move to expand the force beyond just a solitary battalion. While the government had decided to send a battalion, it hadn't made a formal commitment yet, keeping Army planning under wraps until the evening of April 29, 1965, when Prime Minister Robert Menzies announced in Parliament that 1 RR would be sent to Vietnam. Just 3 days later, Mackay and a small planning team arrived in Saigon to meet General William Westmoreland, the commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. The Americans informed them that 1RR was set to become the 3rd Battalion in the 173rd Airborne Brigade, responsible for defending the Bien Hoa Air Base near Saigon. They discussed the proposed roles for 1RR and conducted a reconnaissance of Bien Hoa and Vung Tau, which would serve as the battalion's entry point. Under Wilton's guidance, Mackay evaluated the U.S. 173rd Brigade, confirming that 1RR would be joining a top-notch organization. By that time, Colonel David Jackson had been appointed as the commander of the Australian Army Force Vietnam, and together they established a military working arrangement with the Americans, which Mackay signed on May 5th. Upon returning to Canberra, Mackay joined Wilton on May 13th. The Defense Committee, having endorsed his report, greenlit draft directives for both the commander AAFV and the battalion commander. They also established the command arrangement that designated Westmoreland, rather than the South Vietnamese, as the one to exercise operational control over the Australians. Wilton and Mackay attended the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee of Cabinet meeting on May 18th, which ratified the Defense Committee's report. Mackay remembered facing intense questioning alongside Wilton regarding the security of 1RR's position at Bien Hoa, with Menzies even inquiring about adequate fields of fire. As 1RR was gearing up for operations at Bien Hoa, Wilton felt it was essential to ensure that everything was in order. He arrived in Saigon on June 22nd, committed to avoiding any hiccups in integrating 1RR into an American brigade. While he had his own opinions on the matter, before leaving Canberra, his deputy, Major General Frank Hassett, had reminded him of the pressures he faced commanding the lone Australian battalion in Korea back in 1951. Wilton might have been less worried if it had been an Australian brigade within a U.S. division, but leading a battalion was more challenging. He did not want the brigade commander to think he could treat an Australian battalion like an American one. He informed Westmoreland and the brigade commander that we wouldn't agree to it, and, as diplomatically as he could, expressed his disapproval of how some U.S. brigade commanders had acted in Korea. This, he recalled, was a delicate situation. He received assurances that this wouldn't occur, emphasizing that the battalion commander would be involved and consulted in the planning of operations for his battalion, rather than being thrown into a hastily organized operation at a moment's notice. With that level of preparation, everything went smoothly, as they decided to agree on the task and allow the Australians to execute it in their own way. Wilton remarked, "That's fine, you won't be disappointed." Having addressed these command concerns, Wilton returned to Australia, leaving Colonel Jackson in charge of ensuring the directives regarding the security of the Australians were followed and that 1RR's operations aligned with its designated role. Wilton had barely been back in Canberra for 2 weeks when there was an apparent effort to alter 1RR's role. On July 4th, Jackson updated him that Westmoreland intended to create a general reserve based on the 173rd Brigade, which could be deployed anywhere in Vietnam. He recommended including 1RR. However, Wilton disagreed, explaining in a letter to the Minister for the Army, Jim Forbes, that including 1RR would lead to a series of dangerous operations likely resulting in significant casualties. Jackson, now a brigadier, responded that Westmoreland aimed to carry out offensive operations, especially in the Toot Corps Tactical Zone. Even though 1RR was based in the 3 Corps Tactical Zone, he believed they should participate, as these operations would allow Australians to make a substantial impact on the war. Wilton remained unconvinced. He felt Jackson wouldn't effectively safeguard Australian national interests and worried about the potential for increased casualties. The restrictions on 1RR were still in place when Wilton, along with Major General Tom Daly, head of Eastern Command, visited Saigon for 2 days at the start of September, while en route to a British Army conference in London. On the morning of September 2nd, he met with Westmoreland, who noted in his diary that Wilton expressed regret about the limitations imposed by his government on troop deployment. I informed him that the latest proposal for his forces to operate near Bien Hoa was acceptable at this point in the war. General Wilton proposed, and I wholeheartedly agreed, that we should attempt to resolve these issues through military channels, avoiding diplomatic routes that only complicate matters. The following morning, Wilton messaged Hassett in Canberra, stating that after discussing with Westmoreland, he believed one RAR should be allowed to operate throughout the three-corps area. He directed Hassett to present this proposal to the chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee, Air Chief Marshal Sir Frederick Sherger, for the Defense Minister, stressing that 1RR should take on a more active role. He noted it was the best battalion in the theater, and its morale would decline if it wasn't effectively engaged in a mobile offensive role. Securing the expansion of 1RR's operational area took longer than Wilton had anticipated, primarily due to the Defense Minister. Shane Paltridge became ill and needed approval from the Minister for External Affairs. It wasn't until October 1st that Wilton informed Jackson that 1RAR was ready for operations further from Bien Hoa. This situation highlights the Australian government's stance, particularly Wilton's focus on minimizing casualties and avoiding unnecessary risks for Australian troops amid unpredictable American strategies. Wilton and his team had a distinct view compared to the Americans, who leaned towards an aggressive method, utilizing heavy firepower to eliminate as many enemy fighters as possible. This could lead to significant Allied losses, and Australia was unwilling to take the chance of its lone battalion suffering those losses. Instead, the Australians preferred a more cautious and strategic method in counter-revolutionary warfare. When it came to expanding the Australian forces, Wilton was crucial in devising plans for an increase in Vietnam. Right after 1RR arrived, he and his advisors started contemplating how to develop the force into an independent task force, allowing Australians to implement their own counter-revolutionary warfare strategy. During a Chiefs of Staff Committee meeting on July 15th, he advocated for planning an increase to a task force comprising 2 infantry battalions with additional support, including a detachment of RAF Iroquois helicopters. At the same time, news emerged that the U.S. government might ask Australia to boost its troop contributions. In outlining Australia's potential response, Wilton told Sherger on July 20th that the war in Vietnam was fundamentally an infantry conflict, and that the demand for more forces essentially meant needing additional infantry battalions. While supporting units like artillery, APCs, and engineers were valuable, they played a less critical role in the current scenario. He pointed out that 3RAR had just wrapped up a demanding 2-year tour in Malaya and Borneo and was due for relief and return to Australia. It would be replaced by 4RR, which was ready to head to Malaysia. Upon returning from Malaysia, 320 members of 3RR were set to join the new 7RR battalion. The available battalions were 2RR, 5RR, and 6RR, each with approximately the same number of soldiers. The total was 550, but this included around 100 soldiers who weren't qualified for overseas service due to age restrictions or medical classifications. The earliest these battalions could be operational would be in February 1966. If another infantry battalion were dispatched to Vietnam on short notice, it would significantly disrupt and delay the National Service Program and should only be considered in cases of urgent operational need. Wilton concluded by saying that they should start planning to enhance their existing forces into a task force comprising 2 infantry battalions, along with the necessary combat and logistical support units, plus a detachment of Army light aircraft and RAF Iroquois utility helicopters. Taking this advice into account, on July 29th, the Defense Committee suggested a temporary increase in the force, adding an artillery battery and an engineer troop, with another infantry battalion prepared by February or March 1966. With these plans in place, Brigadier McKay visited Saigon in early August, where he met Lieutenant General John Throckmorton, the acting commander of U.S. Massey V, along with Brigadier General William Dupuy, Throckmorton's chief of staff. They informed him that President Johnson was requesting more Australian forces and wanted to know Australia's intentions. Johnson had approved the deployment of an additional 125,000 troops to Vietnam, and South Korea was expected to send a division as well. Eager to secure an area for an Australian task force, McKay reached out to Dupuy before heading back home. He recounted telling Dupuy to just put a ring around Phuoc Tuy province. "If we're going to come in with a force, this is the place we should enter. Just make sure this area stays ours." Dupai laughed and agreed to mark it for him. This was simply smart planning. While Wilton aimed to expand the force to 2 battalions, he acknowledged that such a force couldn't be sustained just yet. Yet, the conversation about a larger force was clearly in progress. On August 12th, Wilton informed Defense Minister Senator Shane Paltridge that if they needed to send more troops to the field, in addition to the proposed task force of 3,500 plus existing responsibilities in Malaysia and New Guinea, they would be nearing a point where a defense emergency would need to be declared. On August 17th, the cabinet approved sending an extra 350 troops to Vietnam, but instructed the army to halt any further preparations for a task force. This increase allowed the battalion to be bolstered with an artillery battery and an engineer troop, forming a battalion group, an idea first proposed by Wilton on April 27th. For the rest of the year, the Army stopped planning for a 2-battalion task force. However, on November 29th, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara informed the Australian ambassador in Saigon that a request for a 2nd battalion would be forthcoming. On December 7th, Hicks informed Acting Defense Minister Alan Hulme that if an additional Australian presence in Vietnam was deemed most effective, a task force comprising at least 2 battalions, supported by other units totaling around 3,500 men, would be necessary. In the months prior, General Westmoreland had been preparing for the arrival of an Australian task force. For instance, on August 12th, Brigadier Jackson reported to Wilton that Westmoreland expressed eagerness to learn about the status of the Australian task force's progression. While there is no record of a direct talk, it's likely Westmoreland addressed this matter with Wilton when he visited on September 2nd, with Jackson in attendance. Jackson later reflected that during the 3 to 4 months leading up to the task force's arrival, Westmoreland sought his input on potential deployment locations. Jackson conveyed that Australian troops excelled in jungle and mountain warfare, specifically in patrol operations, and might struggle in the Mekong Delta without significant support, particularly equipment, given that the region featured flooded rice fields, extensive water, heavy rainfall, and dense populations. He also recalled that when he visited the U.S. Marines near the demilitarized zone in northern South Vietnam, the Marine commander expressed a strong desire to have Australian forces there. Another option discussed was positioning the Australian task force at Bien Hoa. The airfield was not an option since the 173rd U.S. Brigade was already stationed there. Phuoc Tuy province came up in discussions as it was close enough to Saigon. However, this area had deteriorated significantly over the past few years. The Viet Cong had largely taken control, making it a constant headache for the defenses in Saigon. Since there were no other major forces in the region, it created a clear need for Allied troops, and at that point, there was really no one else available to step in. Brigadier Mackay's visit to Vietnam took place from December 14th to 20th, 1965, but before leaving Australia, he received strict instructions not to suggest that Australia might send additional units at that moment. Yet during his visit, Jackson received solid news that the Australian contribution could be increased to the task force level. Mackay remembered discussing potential areas with General Westmoreland. He noted that Westmoreland had a solid understanding of the situation and aimed to deploy forces in regions that the Viet Cong had not yet faced any resistance, ensuring that various provinces were secured, especially those where the Army of the Republic of Vietnam had no troops. Mackay was uncertain during which visit he met with Westmoreland, having traveled to Vietnam 3 times that year, in May, August, and December. On his visits in August and December, Westmoreland was not in Saigon. However, in December, Mackay did meet with Westmoreland's deputy and his chiefs of operations, planning, and logistics. Mackay laid out the options: the Phan Rang area in central South Vietnam, the Mekong Delta, and Phuoc Tuy province. He dismissed Phan Rang as it was too remote, with little enemy activity, which might invite criticism for not contributing adequately. The challenges of the Delta had already been noted. Mackay stated that the Americans were very eager to have Australian forces in Phuoc Tuy. Given the geography of the province, he believed it would be relatively straightforward to position their smaller force between the 100,000 residents of Phuoc Tuy and the Viet Cong in the surrounding bush, effectively situating them in the center of the action. Here we could play a crucial role in the liberation and defeat of the VC. On December 18th, while Mackay was still in Saigon, Paul Hasluck, the Minister for External Affairs, also visiting Saigon, sent a cable to Canberra. He indicated that the South Vietnamese Prime Minister, Nguyen Cao Ky, had made almost a request for more Army and Air Force support. Following that, on December 23rd, Major General Charles Long, head of the Australian Defence Staff in Washington, reported that Westmoreland envisioned an Anzac Brigade made up of 2 Australian battalions, 1 New Zealand battalion, supporting arms, services, logistics support units, and a SAS squadron. Acting quickly, on January 4th, Hicks sent home 2 documents, one prepared by Schurger in consultation with military chiefs, and the other from Hicks's staff, detailing the forces that could be sent to Vietnam. The cabinet discussed these papers on January 5. While they made no decision, they authorized the chiefs of staff to draft a formal proposal. The Joint Planning Committee, led by Major General Mervyn Brogan, the Director of Joint Service Plans, then developed a comprehensive report on the forces available for deployment in Vietnam. The committee identified that the ground conflict was primarily an infantry war, requiring brigade-sized forces to secure key bases across the country. Some critics later argued that Australia should have deployed a 3-battalion task force, which would have allowed 2 battalions to operate in Phuoc Tuy Province, while the 3rd secured Nui Dat Base. It's important to note that Australia was responding to a direct U.S. request for a 2nd battalion. At this time, 4R was still engaged in operations in Borneo, and the committee believed that while direct confrontation with Indonesia was unlikely, the possibility of limited conflict could not be dismissed. Both 5RR and 6RR would be ready for deployment by May or June of 1966, but 3R, recently returned from Borneo, and 7R, which was newly formed, wouldn't be operational until September. Additionally, 1R was still deployed in Vietnam and would not be ready for operations alongside 2R until October 1966. The last battalion, 8RR, which was in the process of being raised, wouldn't be operational until March 1967. Consequently, planning needed to consider the potential for further developments. Operations might need to continue for an uncertain duration. At this point, only a 2-battalion task force was feasible. There was no plan to send tanks to Vietnam. Such an idea didn't even appear to be on the table. The Defense Committee approved this report on February 10, 1966. Wilton firmly stated that if more forces were requested for South Vietnam, it would not be practical to fulfill that request unless it was a defense emergency. Air Chief Marshal Schurger remarked that a brigade was the ideal unit to operate independently in Vietnam. He warned that if Australia did not send a single national force incorporating all Australian units in the area, it risked losing national identity, valuable experience especially in command roles, and could face the same issues that General Monash encountered in World War I and General Blamey faced in World War II with coordinating national units under a unified command. Additionally, it would subject Australia to tactical doctrines that may not align with its own. A national force would maintain national identity, ensure critical military experience, particularly in command, and would utilize Australian tactical doctrine, thus creating a more effective military presence. These concerns were central to the challenges a smaller nation faces within a larger coalition. Just days later, when Jackson reported that the Americans planned to use the 1RR in operations near the Cambodian border, he objected, and the 1RR was pulled back. Wilton supported Jackson's decision and informed Hicks that it was the first time Brigadier Jackson had to assert his responsibility for the safety and well-being of the AAFV. On March 2nd, the Cabinet reviewed the Defense Committee's report and approved the deployment of a task force consisting of 2 infantry battalions and SAS squadron, combat and logistics support units, along with 8 RAF Iroquois helicopters. The overall contribution, totaling around 4,500 personnel, would include national servicemen. Much of the push to expand the force was driven by Wilton, who recognized solid military reasons for doing so. He later remarked, "When we dispatched our 1st battalion, it was the maximum we could do in terms of force size. We had always suspected in the back of our minds that when our manpower and resources, this would need to be increased. Wilton chooses Phuoc Tuy Province. On March 12th, just 4 days after Prime Minister Harold Holt announced the deployment of the task force, Wilton set off for Saigon for discussions with Westmoreland and General Cao Van Vien, the chief of the Vietnamese Joint Chiefs of Staff. Wilton had prepared a brief outlining his goals in Vietnam and sent it through Scherger to the defense minister for approval. In crafting this brief, Wilton spoke with the new Minister for the Army, Malcolm Fraser, highlighting the benefits of designating a distinct area for the Australian task force. Wilton was joined by Brigadier Bob Hay, who was about to take over from Mackay, and Lieutenant Colonel Alan Stretton from the Directorate of Staff Duties. Shortly after leaving Sydney, Wilton invited Hay and Stretton into the private cabin of the aircraft, typically reserved for off-duty crew members, where, as Stretton recalled, they began planning the specifics of the Australian deployment in Vietnam. In Saigon, together with his advisors from Canberra and Brigadier Jackson, Wilton went straight into a meeting with Westmoreland. They agreed that for all matters concerning Australian forces, Westmoreland would communicate directly with the commander of the Australian Force Vietnam, who would hold the rank of Major General. Mackay was soon to be promoted to that role. The operational oversight of the 1st Australian Task Force would be under the commanding general of the 2nd Field Force, who was stationed alongside the commander of the 2 Vietnamese Corps near Bien Hoa. The 1 ATF would be based in Phuoc Tuy Province, with the Australian Logistics Support Group located in nearby Vung Tau. Further discussions among their teams clarified the roles for the 1 ATF. Its primary tasks included securing and dominating the assigned tactical area in Phuoc Tuy Province, conducting operations to ensure the security of the highway connecting Vung Tau and Saigon, carrying out additional operations within the province, and executing operations throughout the 3 Corps Tactical Zone, as well as the neighboring Binh Tuy Province in the 2 Corps Tactical Zone, as agreed by Westmoreland and COMAFV. Thus, Australia established clear boundaries on the operations. The geographic range of 1 ATF's operations was significant. A crucial decision was to designate Phuoc Tuy Province for 1 ATF. Mackay had already pinpointed it, and Wilton likely discussed options with Westmoreland during their meeting in September. Wilton, Mackay, and the staff at AHQ assessed what was needed for an Australian operational area. Mackay later outlined these criteria in a presentation to the CGS exercise in 1971. They determined the area must have considerable enemy presence, so that it was clear Australia was contributing its fair share. It should not border Cambodia, Laos, or the demilitarized zone. It needed to be a distinct geographical space that could mainly be managed by the task force and easily linked to Australia's national efforts. And it required secure access for shipping and overseas aircraft. Wilton later reflected that the options were Phuoc Tuy or Bien Hoa. While 1 ATF had to operate under U.S. control for military reasons, he preferred not to be tied to an American position. He aimed to retain as much independence as possible to maintain oversight. He believed that their 2-battalion task force was more effective than any U.S. 3-battalion brigade. Placing it in Phuoc Tuy provided the best chance to make a significant national impact, which is always a vital consideration in such wars. He wanted to establish themselves away from the densely populated American areas and operate in a manner he found most effective. Another drawback of Bien Hoa was that Australian resupply ships would have to travel directly into Saigon, risking delays. Phuoc Tuy could be resupplied through Vung Tau. However, the most critical factor was the safety of the force. Vung Tau was on a nearby isolated peninsula, allowing for the evacuation or reinforcement of 1 ATF by Australian National Resources if the situation in the province worsened. As Wilton put it, if things turned dire and disaster loomed, we could take care of ourselves. Weighing all these considerations, Wilton decided, we'll go to Phuoc Tuy Province. Then, as Stretton recounted, they engaged in a face-saving exercise with the South Vietnamese, visiting several generals who each claimed they had decided to assign the province to the Australians. Stretton believed that in choosing the province, Wilton demonstrated exceptional military judgment. suggesting that the loss of life would have been greater had Australian forces been sent to a different province. The choice to establish the Australian Logistics Support Group in Vung Tau brought about additional complications. The only available location was a breezy, sandy area east of the city, but the local mayor informed Wilton and Jackson that they needed approval from a senior military officer in Saigon. So they returned to Saigon, where Wilton recounted how he pressed the officer at a reception just nights before their departure. He stated, "This is the location we want. Can you guarantee it will be allocated without delay?" The general responded, "Oh yes, that will be done." Wilton accepted this commitment, but reminded the general that without the area being made available, we can't bring in our force. Ultimately, Jackson secured the final approval just a week before the first supply ship arrived in Vung Tau, and only after he threatened to have the ship turned around. Why Nui Dat? Wilton's choice to position 1 ATF in Phuoc Tuy province hasn't faced significant scrutiny, but the specific decision to base 1 ATF at Nui Dat in the province's center has been criticized. Brigadier Jackson, who was slated to lead 1 ATF, chose Nui Dat, and Wilton affirmed this choice after they flew over the area on the afternoon of March 14th. Jackson recalled, "I remember flying over Nui Dat with General Wilton. He looked down and remarked, 'Well, one day there'll be an empire down there, won't there?' In other words, we had more or less agreed that this would be the location for the task force." Later, Jackson elaborated that he picked Nui Dat because it was situated between the enemy's main force bases and densely populated civilian areas. The base needed to be secure with a minimal force, provide a small airfield, function as a task force maintenance area, and include tactically placed unit base areas with sufficient room to mount a defense if the base were heavily attacked. Three other factors also played a role. The location had to be elevated above the floodwaters, expected to arrive just a week after the troops were deployed. It was important for the ground to be relatively open and distanced from heavily populated areas, allowing for greater reliance on firepower instead of manpower for defense. Additionally, it needed to be situated close enough to the Vung Tau Baria region to prevent diverting forces for communication security or to facilitate air support. Even after the war, Jackson maintained that establishing 1 ATF at Nui Dat was the right choice. In contrast, Stretton criticized this decision as one of the major missteps made by Australian leaders in Vietnam. The expansive base that ultimately developed required defense, which limited the number of troops available for operations. If they had set up at Vung Tau, fewer soldiers would have been necessary to guard the area. Daly, who succeeded Wilton as chief of the general staff, believed that, in hindsight, developing Vung Tau as the task force base would have been a better option. He thought it unwise to establish two permanent bases in any future similar operations. The development of Nui Dat required significant engineering work that wasn't fully understood at the time of its selection. Brigadier Philip Greville has pointed out that there wasn't anyone accompanying General Sir John Wilton who was knowledgeable about the engineering issues that were crucial for the force's well-being. Lieutenant General Sir Donald Dunstan, who served as deputy commander of 1 ATF in 1968 and Coma FV in 1971-72, saw a fundamental error in how Phuoc Tuy was approached, stating that the arrangement at Nui Dat was problematic. A large, complex base that consumed a lot of manpower. He believed that if they had chosen Vung Tau for the base, they could have saved personnel and had fewer demands for defensive tasks. With the Army's strength in Vietnam, it would have been feasible to deploy 4 battalions, allowing 3 of them to operate continuously in Military Region 3 or Phuoc Tuy. To function effectively in Phuoc Tuy, it was simply necessary to provide fire support bases. I don't think we need to place the base there to keep the enemy away from the civilian population. Wilton disagreed with this viewpoint. He preferred to position the troops away from populated areas. Having the base in the heart of the province still threatened Viet Cong operations. Moreover, if the troops had been based in Vung Tau, American High Command might have wanted to deploy them elsewhere for deep operations, something he aimed to avoid from the start. Major General Mackay, who became Coma FV in May 1966, found the idea of stationing one ATF at Vung Tau ridiculous. He stated, "You can't come in as the bold ones to solve this issue and then retreat to Vung Tau, only to travel out in trucks or helicopters each day to do a job and return to live in a villa by the sea." Yet Mackay insisted that the base he envisioned at Nui Dat was vastly different from the hideous monster it became later. He believed that the maintenance area for the task force should have been in Vung Tau instead. "When I visited there as QMG, I nearly blew a gasket. There were around 290 men just sitting around with an oversized engineer's stores yard filled with refrigerators, timber, and other supplies. I never imagined such a vast asphalt area where you could accommodate half the American Air Force." Historian Greg Lockhart has extensively criticized the choice to establish one ATF at Nui Dat. He notes that the Australian Army's counter-revolutionary warfare doctrine supported the creation of a forward operational base, a strategy that had even been practiced during Exercise Sky High near Singleton in New South Wales in November 1963. Lockhart argues that Wilton, Jackson, and Mackay misjudged the nature of the conflict in Vietnam by claiming that a base at Nui Dat would effectively separate the enemy from the residents of central and southwestern Phuoc Tuy. He highlights that many individuals in Ba Ria and Long Dat, areas the Nui Dat base aimed to guard, either supported or were actual members of the Viet Cong. Lockhart interprets this decision as evidence of Wilton's barrier mentality, suggesting that he and subsequent 1ATF commanders failed to grasp the complex web of relationships between the local population and the Viet Cong. Local guerrilla units and the national main forces faced challenges. Lockhart points out that Wilton missed the crucial tactical significance of the Long High Hills in southern Phuoc Tuy province, which had hosted significant Viet Cong forces for years. This suggests that Wilton and other Australian Army leaders not only struggled to grasp the nature of the conflict in Vietnam, but were also unaware of the Viet Cong's historical presence in Phuoc Tuy. There is an alternative perspective, however. Ian McNeill, the author of the official history, noted that senior North Vietnamese and Viet Cong officers acknowledged that the placement of one ATF at Nui Dat posed a significant obstacle to their operations. In his analysis of the Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, McNeill determined that the decision to station the task force at Nui Dat and carry out subsequent operations aimed to create a separation between the guerrillas and the civilian population, which is a core principle of Australian counterinsurgency strategy. These efforts seemed to be effective, as they forced the enemy to engage the task force, just as Jackson had anticipated. Major General Bob Hay, who accompanied Wilton and Jackson during the reconnaissance in Phuoc Tuy in March 1966 and later served as Coma FV from 1969 to 1970, supported the choice to establish the task force at Nui Dat. He believed it was strategically better to position it between the main population centers and the dense jungle areas controlled by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army. In hindsight, he felt this was a smart decision, even though it led to the development of a substantial base in Nui Dat, a notion that wasn't initially evident in 1966. While Wilton and Jackson's choice to establish one ATF at Nui Dat can be justified as a means to create a visible presence in the province, there might have been different options. Dunstan proposed that the task force could have been centered at Vung Tau, with a smaller fire support base established at Nui Dat, which would have been less extensive than the eventual 1ATF complex. This aligns with Mackay's concept. As the war progressed, battalion fire support bases were successfully set up at Courtenay Hill and the Horseshoe for extended periods, effectively exerting control over the surrounding areas. Significant decisions required deliberation on the location of one ATF in Phuoc Tuy province, particularly at Nui Dat. Dat highlights Wilton's commitment to safeguarding Australian lives, avoiding the more daring American operations. He aimed to give the one ATF the best chance to operate under Australian tactical principles. This was underscored during his visit on the afternoon of March 13, 1966, to 1 RAR on Operation Silver City, deep in War Zone D, where the 173rd Brigade was working to dismantle the Viet Cong's 7th Military Region's headquarters. Just 3 days later, 3 Viet Cong battalions launched an assault on a U.S. battalion, prompting Australian gunners to fire continuously for 4 hours to thwart the Viet Cong attacks. Wilton wrapped up his trip to Vietnam on the morning of March 17th, when he signed a military working agreement with Westmoreland, who noted in his diary that the Australians are pleased to work with us, and there is a sense of mutual friendship among the officers of our two nations and a shared perspective. Wilton then returned home, and on March 23rd, the Chiefs of Staff Committee approved the arrangements he had made in Vietnam. His visit to Vietnam in March 1966 marked the most significant engagement by any Australian military leader during the Vietnam War, and as Malcolm Fraser put it, was executed brilliantly. However, Lockhart and others later contended that the decision to station 1 ATF at Nui Dat was flawed. Regardless of this debate, Wilton's choice solidified the 1 ATF's presence in Phuoc Tuy province and set the operational guidelines that would govern its actions for the remainder of the war. These guidelines reflected the Australian government's policy of minimizing the risk of high casualties. His visit also laid the groundwork for command structures. The decision to appoint the COMA FV, who reports to the Chiefs of Staff Committee through its chair, established a precedent for having an Australian national commander with joint responsibilities, a practice that continues today. As for the 2-battalion task force, it expanded to 3 battalions in December 1967. Confrontation had concluded in August 1966, and 9RR was formed in November 1967. Before the 1 ATF arrived at Nui Dat, Wilton succeeded Sturger as chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. By September 1968, when he achieved his promotion to general, he became the first Australian Army officer to hold that rank. To achieve this rank since General Sir Thomas Blamey was elevated in September 1941. In his new role, Wilton would keep overseeing Australia's commitment in Vietnam until he retired in November 1970. By then, the 1st Australian Task Force, located at Nui Dat and scaled back to 2 battalions, was still active in Phuoc Tuy province.